Hey, what's up YouTube? If you're familiar with my channel, you probably know that I am a huge fan of packing data into UVs and Vertex Color. I'm currently working on a stylized grass course in which I once again demonstrate how pivots can be used to create more intricate wind animations and do all kind of shenanigans. And so I first wanted to work on a Blender add-on that would allow you to bake those pivots into UVs the same way I typically do in most of my projects. Until now I used some super sketchy and limited Python script that I wrote for Blender, and so it was about time I made a proper add-on and publicly released it. For now it's exclusive to my Patreon and available as a tier 2 reward, but I'll make it freely available sooner or later. It grew to be something way bigger than just being a simple tool to bake pivots, and so in this video I'm first going to explain the principle of baking data into UVs and what it can be used for. Then I'm going to showcase what the add-on is capable of, how to use it and what you can do with it in Unreal Engine. Then I'll conclude the video with some technical information like performance concerns and other stuff to consider when using this kind of techniques. Alright, let's go! Say that we have a mesh with a bunch of grass blades, each having their own pivot point. As soon as those meshes are exported to FBX and then imported into any game engine, we end up with a single mesh having a single pivot point, right? And so if we want to add, say, some wind animation and rotate each grass blades around or something, it's problematic. Thus, the need to store those pivot points first so they can be reconstructed in engine and rotation and other effects applied accordingly. Now, if it's the first time you're hearing about baking data such as pivots in UVs, you're probably confused right now, so let me explain this very quickly. It's actually quite straightforward once you realize UVs are not just meant to describe some 2D coordinates to correctly map a 2D texture onto a 3D surface. It's really just a way to store some kind of data per vertex, and you can choose to store pretty much any value. Take that vertex for instance, it's part of that mesh which has its pivot point located here, right? The idea would be to make that vertex store this mesh pivot's X and Y position using a first UV map. The X component in the U channel and the Y component in the V channel. Using a second UV map, we can encode the Z position in the U channel as well if desired. Do that for all vertices and you'll have encoded the pivot point of that specific mesh. Repeat the process for all vertices of all your submeshes and you'll have baked pivots into UVs. Now, it's obviously a huge pain to do by hand, especially considering that going from Blender to Unreal, we have to flip the Y-axis and also flip the V channel of our UV maps, so it gets confusing real fast. Hence why tools and scripts, such as the one I made, are usually created to automate this process. In Engine, those pivots XYZ position can then be simply reconstructed using those UV maps. There's one important detail though. This reconstructed pivot location is not a world location yet. Well, it is if the mesh sits at 0, 0, 0, right? But as soon as we transform the mesh, say we move it around and maybe rotate it a bit, it isn't anymore because those vertices still point to those same fixed baked pivot locations. So we need to transform those pivots from local to world space so that the mesh translation, rotation and scale are also applied to those pivot positions, and voila, we have our pivots in world space. Cool, so that's the idea. We can encode a float or a vector in UVs, like an XYZ position, an axis, a normal, a morph target or anything really. It's quite powerful. Alright, so first you'll want to install the add-on. It's quite simple, open the preferences, go to add-on, click install and search for that Python file I provided on my Patreon. Enable it and you're set. Then in the 3D view, if you select any object, you should see a Bake Data tab in the sidebar. In that first panel we can select what kind of data we want to bake, and in the second panel we have some global settings, the bake button and some information about the upcoming bake process down there. So let's begin with positions. We can choose which XYZ component to include. For each component, we can select where that data is going to be stored, meaning in which UV map and in which channel of that UV map. Typically, we'd have a first UV map to map our textures and potentially a second one for light maps, right? So we may want to use index 1 or 2. Here I'm going to choose the index 1 and the U channel for that X component. and index 1 still but the V channel for the Y component. You'll want to pay close attention to those settings, to make sure you don't override an existing UV map you may need, and also to make sure you don't use the same UV channel twice. This can be seen in that panel down here. See, if I set that Y component to be baked on the U channel as well, there's this error icon here to indicate that this data will overwrite that other data because they both write into the same channel of that same UV map. So pay attention to that and you'll be good. Here I'm going to include the Z component as well. Now, typically for grass, the Z component isn't needed since all meshes are most often flush against the ground, right? So you may want to discard it. Here I'll have to specify a new UV map index because index 1 is fully utilized. Then press bake, export this mesh and import it into Unreal Engine. We may want to double check that Unreal Engine doesn't override one of our UV map with an automated Lightmap UV generation process here. Okay, to use our pivots in Engine, it's quite straightforward. We know that our X component is in the U channel of that UV map at index 1, so texture coordinates 1, red channel. Then texture coordinates 1 still, but green channel for our Y component. And finally, our Z component is in texture coordinates 2, red channel. Combine them to make a vector, transform it from local to world space, and voila, our pivots. If we then use a sphere mask like so, we can clearly see that it's expanding from where those pivots were originally located. We can then make use of those pivots with a rotate about axis node or something, right? Or even scale those planes individually. It opens the door to quite a lot of possibilities. Cool, now we can choose to store this data in UVs, but also in Vertex Color. But that comes with some constraints, because each Vertex Color channel has only 8 bits of precision, so you're limited to positive values that range from 0 to 255 per channel, and so you have to do some tricks if you want to store any positive or negative float value. So the add-on first finds the absolute largest X, Y or Z component, basically the most distant object, and uses that value to normalize all positions in the -1 to 1 range. Add 1 and divide by 2 and positions are now in the 0 to 1 range, which is exactly what we need. Now again, Vertex Color channels have only 8 bits of precision, so if this is our most distant object from origin in X, any position baked into Vertex Colors that are in between will be rounded to one of these 256 evenly distributed X positions. Also in Engine, you need to convert those 0 to 1 positions back to positive and negative centimeters, right? So first multiply by 2 and subtract by 1, and then multiply by what that most distant X position was, which is given to you here. If we use that same sphere mask example, we can clearly see that our pivots are no longer in the center of each of these planes, but are somewhat approximated, which is a limitation you have to accept when encoding positions into Vertex Color. And it may actually be precise enough depending on what you're trying to do with those pivots, right? Usually I wouldn't recommend storing any position or offset into Vertex Color. It's best used for vectors that are normalized from the get-go, like a normal on axis. But I wanted to give the user as much freedom as possible when building this add-on, so it's still an option. Speaking of freedom and options, we can also choose to pick the position of a given object rather than each selected object. I don't see an obvious use case for this, to be honest, but hey, why not? It's at least an option. Down there you can also specify an origin object. By default the whole add-on works relative to the world origin, but you can choose to change that. Again, it's more of an advanced use case and we most likely will want to leave that blank. Moving on, we have the ability to use bit packing. So you can choose to store each XYZ component into a unique UV channel, right? But UV maps are not free, and I'll talk more about that later in the video. So you may want to pack those 3 components into a single float and store it in a single UV channel. Quite cool. Now this ain't no magic. Packing 3 floats into one comes with a very high precision loss when it comes to positions, similar to using Vertex Color, so that might not work for you. If you do use XYZ packing, however, you'll want to make sure to do the 3 following things. 1. You'll need to use full precision UVs in Engine. 2. You'll need to unpack that float in Engine, and I provided a material function to that extent. 3. That material function will need the multiplier value provided by the add-on to unpack that float. Also, small extra detail, if you use that unpacked value to drive any logic in the pixel shader, you'll need to use a vertex interpolator, okay? By the way, if you're curious, the algorithm used to pack and unpack those 3 floats into one is the one I mentioned in a Twitter thread I posted a while ago, so feel free to check that out. So using XYZ packing, you're possibly saving up to 2 UV maps, which is quite the memory gain. But then you have to use full precision UVs, so 32 bits instead of 16, so that lessens the memory gain quite a bit. It also adds a tiny bit of overhead in your shaders to unpack that float, but that's not that bad. So it has its pros and cons, and it's up to you to be the judge of what's best for your own use case. Okay, you can also use what I called AB packing, which will pack not 3 floats, but 2 this time, and you may choose which one. Again, kinda useful for grass, since we most likely will want to discard the Z component, so we may pack the X and Y components into a single float and save a UV channel. Same constraints here though, full precision UVs, the use of a material function I provided and that multiplier value that goes with it, and a tiny bit of math to unpack that float. It does however offer much better precision than XYZ packing because we have to pack one less float, so there's much less data being lost during that process. Alright, I think that covers it for position, and regarding how most of the add-on works, so I'm going to be brief for the rest of these options. Here we can make the orientations of objects on a specific axis. This may be great to apply a rotation on a specific axis around pivot points in engine, or control how much rotation to apply based on how much leaves or grass blades are facing the wind direction, that kind of stuff. There's nothing here that differs from how we bake positions except a few details. One is the extra ability to pack the axis with the position data. For this to work, you'll need to bake positions XYZ components individually, so that ain't going to work with AB or XYZ packing. When doing so, those positions will be rounded to the nearest integer. But considering we're talking about centimeters here, that's barely noticeable, and so the axis will be stored in the fractional part of each float. In engine, we'll have to use another material function I provided to separate the position from the axis. Else, the only other difference with baking positions that I can think of is that when using Vertex Color or AB or XYZ packing, we don't need that multiplier value anymore because the axis is normalized, right? Moving on, we can also bake what's called a shape key in Blender, more widely known as a morph target in other softwares. You can create a shape key and store its offset and normals to recreate that same deformation in engine. And it's quite straightforward to do: create a mesh, a basis shape key, and a shape key containing the deformation, specify the shape key names here, and voila. I use this for quite an old project of mine on those rocks to store a smooth version that I would blend underwater to create an eroded look. It's quite a niche technique, but it has its use for sure. Moving on, you can bake a linear gradient mask. I love this. Say I want to bake a linear gradient on the z-axis in the red channel of my Vertex Color. I can even change the fall-off in case I want a non-linear gradient, press bake, and here you go. What's great about this is that it has many modes. First, you can create a gradient based on your selection. Here I have multiple cubes and I want a normalized gradient on the z-axis based on that entire selection. Press bake and voila. Bottom vertex is black and topmost vertex is white. Then you can bake a gradient for each object individually based on their local axis. And then you can do the same but based on the world axis. You can also create a mesh to more properly control where that gradient starts and where it ends. So select object mode, specify the object here, bake, and voila. That vertex down here equals 0, that one here equals 1, and you get a gradient with vertices that are in between. Finally, you can also do this based on a parent object. So I'm going to parent those cubes to that mesh and select parent in world space mode, and voila, no need to specify the object anymore. What's awesome about this is that you can use that parent mode to build custom gradients for a bunch of meshes. Like here, those 3 cubes are parented to that mesh here, and the rest here are parented to this other mesh, and you get 2 different gradients with just one click. And you can also bake a gradient in the parent's local space as well. So world space means that if you rotate that parent mesh, the gradient, here in the z-axis, is going to be based on whatever topmost vertex and bottommost vertex are in world space, right? If you switch to local space, however, the gradient will now be constructed along the parent's local z-axis, and so you get a different result. Very useful. And it also works with an empty in case the parent's object is 1. Thus, you can scale that empty, or change its display size, or do both, it doesn't matter, and the gradient is going to be based on that arrow's length. And of course, you can choose to bake that gradient in UVs rather than in vertex color. If you do so, you have the option to make that gradient non-normalized, meaning it starts at 0 here still, but the end value around here will no longer be 1, but be the actual planar distance in centimeters along the chosen axis from here to there. Note that this entire baking process can be iterative, right? Say I want to bake a linear gradient on the z-axis on the vertex color's red channel. Here I'm going to choose duplicate so that I keep my original selection intact, and I'm going to make sure merge is turned off. Press bake and the first axis has been baked on those meshes that were duplicated. Then I'm going to bake, say, the y-axis and choose the green channel. Now this time I don't need to duplicate my selection because it's been done already, and assuming that I'm done with the baking process now, I'd probably want to get a merged mesh, so tick that, press bake, and voila. We have our Z gradient in the red channel and the Y gradient in the green channel. Moving on, instead of a linear mask, you can also bake a spherical mask. It's pretty similar to the linear mask, but instead of being a distance based on an axis, it's a 3D distance based on an origin. And you have multiple modes to let you control how that origin is computed. Okay, moving on, we can bake a random value per object. I love this, especially when working with foliage. Like, say you have a grass mesh made of a bunch of grass blades, and you want to further randomize the color of that grass per blade in the shader. Well, that's a great way to do this. You can bake that random value per object and lerp some color based on it. And here we have a setting to select how uniform that random value is. It will probably make sense if I show you this. Here it's uniform, here it's not. Uniform ensures that both the whole 0 to 1 range is used and that each random value is evenly spread apart. Here it's totally random, and so you can sometimes actually end up with not so random looking values. Same thing here but per polygon, because why not? For some VFX it might actually be quite useful. And then finally, not only can we bake our object's own position and axis, but we can bake their parent's position and axis as well to reconstruct a hierarchy in Engine. If you're familiar with Pivot Painter 2, then yes, it's somewhat the same, but Pivot Painter 2 relies on textures to bake this data, and reconstructing the hierarchy in Engine is then quite expensive with many texture samples required. It certainly has its benefits though. Here the hierarchy is all stored in UVs, so you're intrinsically limited by the amount of UV maps Unreal Engine allows you to have, which is 8, so I only recommend you to bake 1 or 2 parents max. Else the amount of UV maps required start to be concerning, and at that point a texture-based approach like Pivot Painter 2 is probably better. Again, it really depends on your use case. Here I have an object parented to another object, which is also parented to another object. So the chain length is 0, 1, 2, so I set the depth to 2. Now that parent data doesn't include the child data, right? So you most probably want to bake position or axis, or both, up here, for that element as well, right? Let's assume I want to bake the parent's position XYZ components individually. The add-on will create all necessary UV maps based on the specified depth, so we just need to specify on which channel it starts the process. Again, we can see a full report on what's going to happen in that info panel down there. You'll note that the hierarchy is stored in reverse order. I found that more straightforward to use in Engine. The first index is the root, then its child, and so on. At this point we can press bake and voila. Then it's up to you to do what you want with this parent data. I provided plenty of examples showing you how to reconstruct the hierarchy in Engine and do things like combining multiple rotate about axis nodes using that parent data to build that kind of effect. And of course you can use AB or XYZ packing with the same pros and cons I mentioned earlier, or pack the parent axis into the parent position as well. I feel like the amount of options exposed here is quite dense, but hopefully it all makes sense. I'd say really pay attention to that info panel to check the full report and ensure that you're not overriding any UV map you'd want to conserve, also that you're not overriding data with some other data, and to check how that data is going to be packed and if it will need a multiplier value in engine. If it does, it will have an icon here to point to the correct multiplier to use. Then make sure that if you use AB packing, you use those AB material functions I provided. Same for XYZ packing, and same if you pack a vector with a position. And voila, I feel like this video and the Unreal Engine demo project I provided on my Patreon should be plenty enough to get you started with the add-on. It ended up having 5,000 lines of code and took me way longer to create than I first thought, but it also grew to be something way bigger than I first anticipated, so I'm pretty happy with the result. If you encounter any bugs or have any question, feel free to contact me however you prefer. I'm very active on Twitter, here on YouTube as well, on my Patreon page of course, and also on my Discord server, which you get access to by joining my Patreon. Okay, this is great, but what does it cost? Because everything has a cost. Well, UV maps are not necessarily expensive, right? They do not have a runtime performance impact per se. They do have a cost, namely a memory one, and thus memory bandwidth, but it's most often negligible. Now that doesn't mean they are free and that you should be careless either. So Unreal Engine allows you to have up to 8 UV maps. By default they are stored in 16 bits, so they don't cost as much memory, but you do get some tiny imprecision from that optimization. It's however usually not noticeable for texture mapping. We can store them in 32 bits if needed, which is called full precision UVs in Unreal Engine, and some of the packing techniques I demonstrated earlier require that kind of precision. So say we have a mesh with 10k vertices and 4 extra UV maps. 16 bits per vertex times 4 times 10k, that would cost you 80 extra kilobytes, if I'm right with my calculations, and double that with 32 bits. It's not that much, but it's something to consider, especially if all your meshes have multiple UV maps. It will start to have an impact on your overall memory budget. But that's not even the only thing to consider regarding UV maps. A UV map can actually increase the vertex count of your mesh. See here, I have a sphere and Blender says it has 482 vertices. However, Unreal Engine says that same sphere has 559 vertices. Why is that? Well, it's actually quite straightforward and I feel like not many people are aware of this. This sphere is UV mapped like so. Now, a single vertex cannot point to 2 UV coordinates in the same UV map. That's just not how things are made, so the mesh is actually split here to create 2 vertices. And so if we manually cut our mesh along that UV seam, we can see that we end up with the proper true vertex count. And it's actually the same for normals. If you have a hard normal, say here, that single vertex will have to store 2 different normals. But again, it's just not how it works. So it's split in such a way that one vertex can have this normal and the other vertex that normal. That's the precise reason flat shading causes a drastic increase in vertex count, because each face is split and vertices are all duplicated. And same principle with vertex color, right? So all this is quite relevant when you bake all kind of data into UVs or vertex color, because you can easily end up needing to store multiple values per vertex and so create splits in the geometry. And that's precisely the case for this random value per polygon here, right? Each vertex here are part of 4 faces, and each face points to a unique value in the UV map. And so each face must be split in order to have unique vertices, so that each vertex can point to a unique UV coordinate. Now, most other data you can bake here fortunately do not create a split, so it's fine, but it's definitely something to know. Here's the second very important thing regarding UV maps. Unreal Engine have to store different kind of data per vertex to render that geometry. Most obvious vertex data would be its normal. Unreal Engine also actually needs a tangent and a binormal per vertex. To optimize memory usage though, tangents are discarded and are instead computed on the fly using the normal, binormal and the first UV map of your mesh to tell in which direction that tangent points. So it's never a good idea to mess with that first UV map. Always unwrap it properly, else you can have rendering issues. Here's a simple demonstration. I have a mesh here and its first UV map is complete garbage. Let's presume I baked some kind of data in it, right? The second UV map, however, is properly unwrapped and we'll use that one to map our textures. See that result? It's garbage due to that first UV map and Unreal Engine not being able to properly derive those tangents. However, you can derive a tangent based on a second UV map, so be aware of that. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend using the first UV map to store some arbitrary data. Also, another thing to consider is if you're going to use backlighting or not. Although you can change which UV map is used for backlighting, it's probably best to keep a consistent workflow and keep using index 1 and then store your data on the following channels. Okay, I think I'm done. You know everything. I'm kidding, it's probably not even close to the full picture, but oh well. That's it, I hope you learned something. Again, the add-on is for now available as a tier 2 reward on my Patreon. Thanks to all my supporters, it's really pushing me to create more stuff, so yeah, feel free to join in and get access to all kind of cool projects, and also enable me to create this kind of videos. You're awesome. Thanks for watching, take care of yourself, bye bye!